Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. The update's been out for about a week or so now, and most people know how good Shang-Chi is in PvP content as well as PvE, but I wanted to look at how good the rest of the characters for the update are, specifically focusing on the characters that got an awakening, but I'll also touch a little bit on how Wenwu performs as well as Katie as a support. Besides this, I'll also make some recommendations on potential builds that you can have for Shang-Chi in PvP, as well as potential teams that you can use him on in Alliance Conquest. That's not limited specifically to Shang-Chi, since I'll cover that for the rest of the characters that were upgraded this patch as well, and even mention some potential counters to Shang-Chi in PvP modes. These are what my card stats look like. They're the same as the last time I tested, so I still have 16% Pierce and over 100% all attack. I'm not really going to go in depth on how Shang-Chi performs in PvE content. He's pretty good, and all the testing that I did here was with a CTP of authority rather than a damage proc. I did include some world boss ultimate testing between his T2 and T3 upgrades to show you just how important it is to get him T3 and how big of a difference it makes to get that upgrade for him. So you can see that just at T2 I can finish Thanos stage 50 with a minute and 1 second remaining, and then at T3 I finished the same content a minute and 41 seconds faster, which is pretty interesting considering that the T3 skill does 0 damage, but is just a straight buff to your entire kit. Surprisingly enough, I also finished stage 99 of Proxima with 34 seconds remaining, which is surprising because he doesn't have any all defense down that ignores immunity. So it's pretty nice that they're making new characters now that have kits that vary a little and don't rely entirely on all defense down to function outside of World Boss Legend at least. In this fight you can get a better idea of just how significant that T3 is and a good rotation, since I'm able to complete the same content that I did at T2 almost 3 minutes faster. I can't really give you a set rotation since I didn't practice enough to get kind of an ironclad one, but in essence, you basically just want to spam the 5th skill and then do your 1st skill and then the 5th skill as fast as you can, and then kind of fill in between the gaps with your 3rd and 4th skill. When your ultimate is up, you basically want to insta-cancel that and go into your hardest hitting skill that you have available. So that will most likely be either the 5th skill or the 4th skill. You might be wondering why I'm using a CTP of authority rather than maybe a CTP of regen, at least for PvP purposes, and that's due to the amount of healing that he gets from his 3rd skill being around 50%, and because of his damage mitigation on his uniform passive being, I think, over 40% or exactly 40%. The reason those stats are important is because I don't need a CTP of regen since his healing is already pretty significant with his 3rd skill, and because he can spam it often, he can pretty much get to full health even without using the recovery stat from the CTP of regen. Besides this, that 40% damage mitigation means that if you have a CTP of authority that's reforged with that steel effect that gives you mitigation on top of your uniform passive, you can basically get up to 70% total since you get 40 from the uniform passive like I mentioned before, and if you get a max roll for the steel effect, it goes from 20 up to 30%, so 70% total. The math behind the scenes isn't exactly like that, so you won't actually get 70% total, but you'll get a lot of it so that your damage taken is very minimal. That makes it really good for PvP content since you can basically tank through a lot of the damage and be able to reflect it back when the 3rd skill is up. Now, this isn't to say that CTP of regen is worse than CTP of authority. That really all comes down to preference, but I find that having very good kind of damage mitigation natively coupled with a skill that has very high instant heal works really well with the CTP of authority with that steel effect or the damage mitigation stacking even higher. Usually use a CTP of regen when the character has a high health pool or the healing is kind of average or good to bump it up very high and increase that survival. But since his healing is already really good, then you can focus on survival in other areas. And don't forget that if you have that reforged CTP or the steel effect, you also have super guard break immunity, as well as the damage accumulation, which also benefits his reflect and base damage as is. If you paid close attention to the clips in the background, you would have noticed just how well this build works on Shang-Chi and how good he is in general. He essentially just spams his third skill with the iframe, ignore, and the reflect endlessly, and the opponent basically just takes out themselves. In terms of his performance, he's up there with Luke Cage Daredevil, being one of the best PvP characters that you can build for the cost being so cheap. And the funny part is that you don't even really need him at T3 for him to be able to do this, since the majority of his kit is dependent around that third skill reflect damage. He can basically do what he does at T3 at T2 as well. Moving on to the first of the Awakening characters that I'm going to be looking at is Swordmaster. To be honest, his newest uniform doesn't really do too much for him besides making him a functional character in PvE. And as a functional character, he isn't very good since he can barely beat stage 50 of Thanos despite the fact that I don't have a damage proc. If you've watched some of my previous videos, you would know that most often I test stage 50 of Thanos with characters that don't have a damage proc, and they're still able to clear it within a reasonable amount of time. Unfortunately, if you want to build him for PvE, he isn't really going to do that great since he's lacking a lot of the modern mechanics or skills that would make a character good in PvE content. Even his 6th or Awakened skill doesn't give him anything like damage accumulation. To add to that, most of his skills can't really be cancelled or layered on top of one another with the exception of his 5th skill and his 6th skill or his Awakening skill. So a potential rotation that you might want to use if you use him for PvE is open with the 5th skill after he plunges the sword into the ground, then you go into your 4th skill, your 3rd skill, and then your 2nd and 1 are filler. Once you have him awakened, you do 5th skill first, and then delay cancel into the 6th skill, which you cancel right away, and then go into the rotation from before, being the 4, 3, and then the 1 and 2 filler. With the Awakening and Transcendence, I finished 2 minutes and 3 seconds faster, which is actually pretty decent, but if he was really good at this content, I would have finished with over 3 minutes remaining. You can see almost an identical outcome versus Proxima stage 99 in that I finish with nearly no time remaining, but actually 1 second left. Then with the Awakening Transcendence upgrade, I finish 1 minute and 54 seconds faster. Even though his raw damage isn't the best, his survival is actually pretty good considering that he doesn't have healing or a recovery skill. His 5th gives him 5 seconds of invincible, his 4th is a pretty decent length iframe, and the 3rd skill gives him 4 seconds of damage immunity. So if you throw in something like a regen to give him some healing, and a health shield, or possibly an authority for that additional invincible, then he becomes pretty tanky for content like PvP. And considering that he also has super armor in his kit, you could also use something like Transcendence or even an Obelisk. One thing I wouldn't recommend using is a CTP of Destruction, since he natively has 50% chance to penetrate barriers and shield in his kit. It'll conflict with the proc on the CTP of Destruction that gives up to 30% penetration to all sources, and will basically never be active. Only the damage proc will activate. So if you really want to go with a damage proc for the character, a CTP of Greed will likely be a better option. Wave suffers largely from the same issue as Swordmaster in that her uniform doesn't really make her good, but it does make her functional. Unfortunately, unlike Swordmaster, there's little substance behind the skills, even though the visuals are really nice. You can notice in this clip that the character is already awakened, since I wasn't able to clear the content with just the uniform itself. And even with the Awakening and Transcendence combo, her finish time is pretty lackluster in that she completes this content with 1 minute and 17 seconds remaining, which is especially kind of sad since she does have an insight, which is kind of like a mini proc. For the majority of players, I suspect that they'll leave a CTP of insight for her and make her a dedicated support. Taking that into consideration, I believe that the majority of players won't really benefit from her uniform in any way, and considering the fact that it's kind of a premium uniform since you can only upgrade it through bios from the heroic quest, it's kind of advisable just to skip the uniform and maybe just focus on the Awakening and Transcendence if you want to get some value from her in PvP content. Considering how poorly the character performs as a standalone character and the fact that the uniform is a premium cost, the devs should really think about adding some more value to the uniform in something like a mid-month update or a little bit later. Right now, the only point of the uniform is that it gives 10% more damage versus supervillains on her tier 2 passive, and that only applies to heroes. So one very small change that the devs could make to add a lot of value to the uniform is to change the tier 2 passive to apply from only heroes to all allies. This would also fix the problem with Namor's uniform that makes him into a villain, in which he can benefit from Wave's leadership, but not her passive. If they made this change, he would get full benefit from the leadership and the passive. Outside of that, it's really up to the devs to figure out what they would need to change to make the character more viable as a solo or standalone character, though I did test her in PvP content, and because she's so lackluster as a standalone character, I don't really have any footage to show in that regard. One final thing to note, since I was talking about the passives before, if Namor does get a new uniform that turns him into a hero, Wave also now gives 25% increased damage to her leadership to all allies, as well as the 60% additional damage to Namor himself. So if you add that all up, Wave alone would give Namor 135% additional damage just from one character slot. Just something to think about, since the uniform doesn't have a completely fixed value and is a little bit dependent on the upgrades that Namor gets. Regardless, I would pass on this uniform as it stands. Of the 3 awakened characters, Aero is the most interesting since she has the most value for both PvE and PvP. I previously had a CTP of Destruction on her, so all my testing is done with that, but this first test is a stage 50 of Thanos with no uniform or awakening of any kind, just to give you an idea of how well she did before any of the upgrades came around. So you can see that with the damage proc, I am able to complete the content with 21 seconds remaining. Unlike Wave and Swordmaster, Aero's uniform actually does a lot for her. Her 5th skill gets 1 second of invincible added to the previous 4 seconds that it had. The 4th skill gets damage immunity added to it where it previously didn't have it at all. The 3rd skill gets 15% healing as well as higher damage accumulation for damage dealt, and her 2nd skill gets 50% increased damage to the next skill that's used, which can be used on the 2nd skill itself, which does a lot of damage, or I'm pretty sure you can cancel it and apply it to another skill, though it's a little bit trickier. After testing around certain rotations for her with the CTP of Destruction, she isn't really the best character for a single skill damage proc, so I'm pretty sure that if you want the most out of her in PvE content at the very least, you more than likely will have to go for a Rage to optimize her rotation. The reason that I mentioned that she isn't proc friendly is because most of her skills have a little bit of a lingering effect added to the end of them, so if you want to get maximum damage from them, you have to kind of delay cancel them, and as you may know, that's not really ideal if you're trying to proc on a certain skill. One thing that you can do to make this better is to proc early so that you can kind of set up your rotation to proc on the skill that you want. Regardless, the rotation that you want to use is you do 3 and delay cancel after she's hit the ground, then you do 4 and delay cancel again after she's hit the ground, and then you do your 5th skill and you delay cancel that after she has cast the kind of sphere thing that appears, and then you go into your 2nd skill. You ideally want to proc on the 2nd skill while all these other skills are lingering and doing damage as well. So like I said, this is tough to get the maximum from the skill rotation with something like an energy, but if you have a Rage, then it's not really a problem since all of these skills are going to be chipping damage since they're already cast and lingering around while you go into your 2nd skill. As you can see from the uniform alone, I can clear the content pretty much 2 minutes faster than before. Then once you've awakened or transcended the character, the rotation changes just slightly in that you do the 3 delay cancel after she touched the ground, then you do 4, delay cancel after she touches the ground, 5, and then delay cancel after the little orb thing appears, 6, you can cancel instantly, and then you stay in your 2 skill to do the maximum damage. With the Awakening skill and Transcendent stat bump, you can basically shave off another minute from the clear time, so I finish with 3 minutes and 15 seconds remaining, which is very close to a minute faster than the previous clear. To give you a better perspective on how good the uniform and the Awakening upgrade is, without either, I wasn't able to complete Cull and finished with about 4.5 health bars left. With the uniform, I reached that same point about 2 minutes and 50 seconds faster, and then with the Awakening and Transcendence on top of that, I finished about 1 minute faster than that. I included a Galactus clip to give you an idea of how much damage the rotation does if you proc properly, though I didn't proc on the 2nd skill. I actually finished proccing on the 5th skill since I was still kind of experimenting at this point. Regardless, you can see that you can kind of make a single skill damage proc work, though it's not really that fun to try and make it work, and it's not the most ideal. Anyways, my point from this is that if I had built up the character enough and probably went with an energy or a rage or something and just kind of built her optimally for PvE, she could be one of those characters that is kind of like a one-shot on Galactus or other content like Danger Room Extreme or something. And then to put her damage into perspective of World Boss Legend, you can see that I can clear her with a leadership, support, and strikers on stage 15 with that destruction CTP. In PvP, you might want to go with a CTP of Greed if you want to get the maximum damage because of her lingering skills. I'm not really sure you'll get too much benefit off the CTP of Destruction, since it's mostly just going to be there for the penetration, and you won't really benefit too much from a single skill getting a lot of burst damage because all of the other ones are kind of interfering with that proc. If you want to go more defensive, then Authority is an easy option, or you could even go with Regen, since her base damage when you awaken and transcend her is actually pretty good, and she does have that heal on the 3rd skill. I'm obviously testing the CTP of Destruction that I mentioned, but I might possibly try a Greed. I'm not really tempted to go into a CTP of Authority or Regen, since her survival is pretty decent with all her iframes and invincible and immunity scattered throughout her skills. You can see her survival in this background clip where she's basically just hopping from one iframe skill to another. Another reason why I'm messing with the damage proc first instead of a survival based build is because if you're facing top metas in content like Alliance Conquest, you want to burst them down quick, otherwise you'll run out of those iframe skills and then they can in turn burst you down quick and take you out. As a quick note, I didn't really cover Wenwu or Katie for PvE content since there's so many other characters that can go further because of an Awakening and a T3, which they don't have. That said, from the brief testing that I did, they're surprisingly good in PvE content even at level 60. However, in PvP content, I don't think Katie is really going to help you much, since she only really has one semi-short iframe in her kit and 6 seconds of immunity. Other than that, her survival isn't that great, and I doubt that adding Invincible or a Regen is really going to help that. So most people, I'm pretty sure, will use an Insight and just use her as a support in things like Alliance Conquest. Wenwu, on the other hand, does have some potential as a standalone character, but he still ultimately falls short since so many other characters have a T3 and Awakening upgrade now. His skills are a little bit sluggish in that his skill animations are kind of slow, so oftentimes he'll get stuck in non-iframe skills, which really kind of hurt his chances of survival. If you really want to make him work as a solo character, then you're more than likely going to have to go with a survival-based build, such as with a CTP of Authority, though because his passive gives you 25% increased health, as well as to your villain allies, then you could possibly also go with Regen, though he won't get as much health as he would have if he had that Transcendence or T3. So it's really up to you. You kind of have to stack a lot of HP on him to make that regen work. You can see that one of the teams that I was messing around with in Timeline was using his leadership primarily to boost up other characters that are already kind of tanky. So characters like Hulk would benefit a lot since that HP gets converted to damage, and he also gives that little bit of healing from his leadership besides that debuff to villains. The last thing that I want to look at is how these characters perform in Alliance Conquest. By now, you probably already know that Shang-Chi is really good in Alliance Conquest since he's great in Timeline as well. One thing that I was testing out with him in Alliance Conquest is how to best support him and protect him against some of his counters. So some of those counters are things like high physical reflect characters or meta characters that deal a lot of burst damage. To account for that, one thing that I tried out was to use Rescue as support to basically heal him and also bring that energy damage in case physical reflects are used. Unfortunately, as you saw in the beginning of the other clip that I'm repeating, if the other team has a lot of iframe users, Rescue basically goes all over the place and the third bubble dome doesn't end up healing the characters that I want. So in this next test, I swap out Rescue for Shuri in order to get that increased damage versus some of the top metas currently, which are Doom, and to get that extra damage mitigation with his Reforced CTP of Authority and his Uniform passive. You may have also noticed that I'm consistently using Supergiant Leadership. She ends up comboing really well with Shang-Chi because she has that debuff leadership. She's an awakened character, so she can take out the second set of opponents, and because she's energy based, again like Rescue, if the opponent uses a physical reflect team to take out Shang-Chi, she still has the ability to take them out or help against that. On top of that, she also has that really useful iframe ignore, and if the opponent tries to use something like Thanos with a support, then she can counter that because Thanos's superhero damage mitigation doesn't apply to her since she's a villain. Here I was just experimenting with another team using Katie as a support, but like I mentioned before, Katie won't really do much else besides support in Alliance Conquest. And even though I ended up losing the majority of the team, Shang-Chi can basically solo tiles. Most times people will combo Shang-Chi with top metas like Doom, so if you're having trouble taking them out, the best kind of team that you can use against him is a reflect. So the ones that I try out versus those are Silver Surfer with Colossus support and Thanos because he has that hero damage mitigation. Wenwu can work on a lot of teams due to his great leadership and support passive, but the team that I tried him out on was ones with characters that are already kind of tanky to make them tankier. As you can see in this first test, I paired Wenwu with Apocalypse because his HP pool is already pretty big, and with that support passive, it gets even better. Proxima is a really great third for this team since her support passive boosts both Apocalypse and Wenwu boosts her by giving her more HP and debuff, as well as that little healing when the debuff cleanse occurs. Wenwu's survival with the CTP of Authority is pretty good, and he'll survive more often than not when putting him up against meta teams. The benefit of this particular team composition is that all three characters deal energy-based damage, and although that might seem like a disadvantage if the opponent uses energy-based reflect characters, it does allow you the flexibility to take on other meta sets, like the Defenders, for example, that reflect physical damage. More than likely, the go-to team for Wenwu will be to pair him with Hulk, since Hulk gets that damage increase from the HP passive that Wenwu provides. Besides this, adding a good third will help make a really good rounded out team. So having a character like Ebony Maw, for example, adds a blast type that can be used to counter the Defenders team that will likely be used to counter Hulk. In addition to this, Ebony Maw's Uniform passive will make Hulk even tankier and be able to deal more damage versus universal types. Note that Wenwu was able to survive both of these last fights with that CTP of Authority build. As I mentioned previously, Wave is primarily going to be used as a support in PvP content, so that likely means that you're going to be using an insight on her, and that you will likely use her on a meta team versus another meta team. So she isn't very likely to survive, and you won't get too much benefit off the Awakening, but if she does survive, then you're guaranteed to wipe the second team. That's all I can really say about that. Aero and Swordmaster aren't necessarily going to be at the top of the list for awakened characters in terms of PvP, but regardless, they're still pretty good nevertheless. The CTP of Destruction build that I have on Aero is a little bit of a hit and miss, so that's why I previously mentioned that I was thinking of experimenting with the CTP of Greed, though it's not the worst thing in the world either. Since CTP of Destruction conflicts with Swordmaster's passive, meaning that he won't be able to ever really use that 30% penetration to all sources. Going with the authority-based build made him really tanky and have very high survival. He frequently ends up surviving through most characters' skills and then going into his awakening to wipe them out. If you're using that CTP of authority build on Swordmaster, one character to avoid facing him against is probably Proxima, since she does have that native penetration. You can see that in this clip where I kind of figured that out, but you'll also see that the CTP of destruction build that I was running on Aero paid off, since she was able to wipe out the rest of the team and then wipe out the second team. I didn't necessarily test Swordmaster and Aero versus some of the higher tier teams, since I don't really think that they can stack up versus them consistently, but being able to take out characters like Supergiant and Proxima isn't really that bad. Even though a Thanos and Jean team isn't as good as it once was, it does give you a good idea of how good the characters that you're using against them are if they're able to take down that set. So you can see that here, both characters end up surviving against this team and are still able to take down Thanos that has that hero mitigation without my team actually having any other kind of damage buff, not a damage lead or a damage support. And even though this second set, being the Warriors of the Sky, isn't transcended but is awakened, that's why they're using the awakened skills, you can see what I meant about the two characters' survival, since my CTP of Destruction Aero was able to survive their awakening skills and still win. After seeing how these characters perform in PvE and PvP content with and without their uniforms and T3 awakening transcendence upgrades, you might still be wondering whether you should invest in them or not, and if you want a definitive answer from me, I would say probably wait or hold off and see what other options are coming down the line, or if you don't have some of the other great upgrades that came before this, you can focus on them first. Outside of Shang-Chi, which you should definitely upgrade, the other characters won't necessarily make a huge impact on your roster, so you won't really lose out too much if you don't invest in them right away. Anyways, that's the end of this video. I'm working on some other ones about counters in Timeline and Alliance Conquest, which should be coming pretty soon, though I think there's a mid-month coming around next week, I believe around Tuesday, so I might be covering that before those counter videos for PvP. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing, since it helps my channel grow and provides you more content to help you out. And of course, if you have any questions, you can leave them in the comments and I'll get back to them as soon as I can. Thanks for your time and watching, but the video is now over.